Hello and a very warm welcome to Queen Mary University of London. My name is Professor Alastair Owens and I'm one of the human geographers. And today I'm going to be talking to you about one of my favourite topics, which is that of place change in East London through the lens of what I'm calling hipsterfication. So one of the best things about being a human geographer in East London is that there's so much to get interested in on my doorstep. And for the past 28 years, I've lived in Hackney, also nearby in the East End. And when I moved there in 1993 with my then girlfriend, now wife, it was an inexpensive place to live in. Rents were cheap, £48 per week for a room in a shared furnished flat. And although we weren't on a tube line, Hackney is an easy place to get to by bus. And if you're feeling energetic, you can walk from my part of Hackney to the West End in just over an hour. And even better, at that time I could walk to my workplace here at Queen Mary, where I was studying for a PhD, in around about 30 minutes. But in 1995, Hackney had a bit of a reputation. The low rents reflected the fact that it was not really seen as a desirable place to live in. It was known to be one of London's most deprived boroughs, and in fact it was in the top 10 most deprived boroughs in the country. An eminent urban geography friend of mine told me that a nearby street, Wells Street, had been designated Britain's most deprived road back in 1991. Hackney also had low levels of educational attainment, and you can see here that unemployment was a major issue. Back in 1993, it had the highest rate in the country at just over 25%. And there was also a significant problem with crime. So Hackney at this moment was described as inner city, a label that became a byword for a place that had entrenched and seemingly intractable economic and social problems. But like many places in and beyond London, Hackney has changed over the past quarter of a century, and I've watched it change before my eyes. In fact, I've come to recognise that I'm part of the change and I've played a role, albeit a very small one, in changing Hackney as a place. And one change in Hackney that lots of people have noticed is the arrival of new populations, and especially the celebrated but also much derided figure of the Hackney hipster. So I'm sure you've all seen hipsters, perhaps you know some hipsters, maybe you even are a hipster. But if you were in Hackney, you would notice that the hipster men often wear beards, as illustrated here. And if you were playing I Spy Hipster, beards would be one of the first things that you would look for. Maybe also vintage clothes, ill-fitting trousers, check shirts, dodgy or no socks are all part of the, if you like, the hipster uniform. You might wear a hat, ironically, or comically, as this gentleman is doing here, or carry around vintage tech with your pink trousers and orange bow tie. Apparently, we even have hipster babies and hipster police officers here in East London. So hipsters are alternative. They do things differently. They are on trend, as this definition here suggests. The figure of the hipster has captured the public's imagination, and the media and social commentators portray this curious and indulgent being as an agent of urban change. So hipsters are supposedly transforming the places we live in, leading processes of inner city gentrification in London and in other major cities across the Western world. And it's suggested actually that the first hipsters were of course North American, probably originating in New York. So we poke fun of them, but they seem to stand for something significant and indeed also something profoundly geographical. So in Hackney and the East End of London more generally, we can see evidence of what some people have called hipsterfication. So we can witness the impacts of hipsters on changing places. So in Hackney you can see trendy barbershops opening up, offering expensive haircuts, facial hair trimming and personal grooming products to condition those lovely beards. Hipsters like their food, don't they? Usually high quality, handmade, locally sourced, and often reassuringly expensive. Sourdough, for example, is signature hipster food which you would buy from your artisan baker, and there are many of those springing up under railway arches and in abandoned warehouses around the East End of London and other cities. What else do the hipsters like? Well, the smell of roasting coffee is a very familiar one in my part of Hackney, which seems to have an obsessive devotion to the bean, with independent shops and stalls now more common than the ubiquitous Starbucks or Costa. So in Hackney, you don't really drink a cappuccino or a latte. You would have a flat white or a long black, or maybe the guest roast espresso, as you can see here at this rather lovely coffee shop, in fact, called Climpson's on Broadway Market in Hackney. Craft beer would be another significant sign of hipstification, and according to Google there are 10 craft breweries, quite remarkable that, within a mile of my house, where they handcraft pale ales, lagers, stouts, porters, for sale now in local pubs, in bottle shops and in tap rooms, another hipster phenomenon. So I was not surprised to learn recently that I live pretty much around the corner from something that somebody has called the Hackney Beer District. And look, see, you can even buy a bottle of beer called the Hackney Hopster, a nice play on our hipster theme. So on a warm Saturday afternoon in June, these hipsters hang out in large numbers in places like London Fields in Hackney, drinking their pale ale, barbecuing their rare breed pork sausages, although these days they've banned the barbecues, maybe dancing to impromptu DJs, and indeed, judging by the aroma, perhaps smoking weed. Now I have to admit that I rather like a lot of this hipstification. So toasted sourdough, a strong long black coffee from Climpson's and the occasional craft beer have become enjoyable parts of my own life in Hackney. And I no longer rent a flat there, but after entering the housing market by buying our first one-bedroom property in 1997, when London housing was far more affordable, my wife and I have since traded up, and we now live in a nice 4-bedroom terraced house, which we've recently extended, and enjoy living there with our family. So we've got 3 kids. We both work in full-time jobs, professional jobs, and therefore we have the income to enjoy our life amongst those Hackney hipsters. We can drink their coffee, we can eat their bread, and we can sip their cocktails too. So today I'm here to talk to you about changing places, and that's a theme that's part of the A-level geography course that many of you will be studying. And Hackney hipsters symbolise change in my neighbourhood, or the place where I live. And it may seem like I'm trivialising geography by talking about sourdough bread and beards and craft beer and things like that, but I think actually there are some extremely interesting and important geographical issues that stand behind the hipstification, if you like, of Hackney. And in a moment I want to continue talking about Hackney in order to consider how that place has been changing, what have been the key changes, what's caused them, and how have they altered Hackney as a place. And hipsters and recent processes of gentrification are part of that story, but we also need to think about other groups and people from different backgrounds. We need to look backwards in time. Who has benefited from change in places like Hackney? That's going to be a key question. So as a 51-year-old white middle-class home-owning man with a family, I've done quite well really, and my life in Hackney has improved over the past 28 years. But has it improved for everybody? And I think that's a really good research question that we could ask actually of any place. Is life getting better in that place? For whom is it getting better? And for whom is it maybe not getting better? So questions that you could ask about the place that you come from too. First though, a little bit of geographical theory. So Doreen Massey, who very sadly died in 2016, was an important and well-known human geographer who wrote a lot about the idea of place. So she published many books and research articles dealing with a range of geographical issues, but it was her work on place that perhaps was her most important intellectual legacy for the discipline. And I could talk for hours about Doreen Massey's work, but let me right now pull out two things from her writing that might be useful to us when studying changing places, and then later on to think about how they might be useful to us in thinking about hipsters in Hackney. So first of all, in a book that she published in the 1980s called Spatial Divisions of Labour, Massey became very interested in how places, or regions, in fact, was a particular focus then, how places change over time. And she argued that if we take a careful look at a particular place, we can begin to detect different layers of that place's history. By that she meant different phases of its decline or its development. And it's that what makes places distinctive, or one of the things at least that makes places distinctive, she suggested. Massey was particularly interested in economic change and how places in the 1980s were bearing witness to structural economic shifts that were reshaping them. So she was examining at that moment the change from an industrial to a post-industrial economy that many places in Britain were experiencing. So as manufacturing was declining, a new layer in the history of many places was being laid with the emergence of a post-industrial economy. Just as 150 years previously, many places might have transitioned from being agricultural settlements to industrial towns. And if we look carefully at a place, if we visit it, if we observe it, if we do some field work, we can often see traces or legacies of former economic activities. So she argued places are a little bit like palimpsests, and that's what's illustrated in the bottom right-hand corner of my slide there, just above where I'm speaking. It's a piece of writing or material, or parchment with text on it, over which other text has later been written or superimposed. And the metaphor there is that places are constantly being overwritten too, with new phases of development. So that's our first bit of theory. And we can think of this as a kind of historical, or an explanation for historical change. Second, later in her career, Doreen Massey developed another theory to explain how places are made through their geographical relationships with other places. And she said that in the modern world, and particularly in the context of processes like globalization, with which you'll be familiar, places are profoundly shaped by global connections. The flows of people, migrants, the flows of goods, money, capital, of ideas and cultures, so literature, music, food, all those sorts of things, they shape places here in London and elsewhere, things that come from other parts of the world. So in this conceptualization, Massey encourages us to think about places not as static entities, but as intersections of ever-changing global flows. So places are less a thing, they are more a process. Place is a very dynamic thing, she argues. It's constantly changing. And she illustrates this idea by considering the place where she lived. And she lived in London too, and she lived to the northwest of the city in Kilburn. And she famously said, "It's impossible to begin thinking about Kilburn High Road in North London without bringing into play half the world and a considerable amount of British imperial history." So there's our theory. So let's now move back to Hackney to illustrate some of those ideas, to apply that theory to our case study. So first, a little bit of history. In 1830, there were no hipsters in Hackney. And in the centuries before 1830, Hackney was actually just a village, quite separate from London. And in this phase of its history as a place, the small population of Hackney made its living from farming and market gardening, so often supplying food to London, to the capital. By the Victorian era, the area was changing quite rapidly. Parts of Hackney began to industrialise. It was, for example, the centre of London's furniture making industry. And we can see workshops and factories springing up along roads, canals and railways. And these economic activities draw in a working class population, people who earned a living through making stuff, such as those gentlemen pictured there. Other parts of Hackney were developing at this time as middle-class suburbs, housing those who'd usually made their living elsewhere, for example within the already global financial economy of the City of London, the square mile not that far away from Hackney. Much of Hackney remains Victorian, and this layer, to go back to Doreen Massey, in its history is very visible today, with many of those 19th century houses occupied by affluent contemporary middle-class Londoners, including some of our hipsters. So Hackney's population increases rapidly over the course of the 19th century, peaking at around 380,000 people in the early 20th century, when Hackney had also reached, if you like, its economic or industrial zenith. And you can see that the population today is still lower than it was back then, although the most recent census puts it at 259,000 people. But reminding us of how places are shaped by their connections with other places, that other Doreen Massey idea, some of this 19th century growth in the population was as a result of migrants settling in Hackney, especially East European Jews who fled from their homelands because of persecution. And this is a very interesting table here, taken from a survey in 1881, based upon the census in fact, which shows that over 21,000 people living in East London at that time were born overseas. So London, or East London, already quite a cosmopolitan place. In fact, migration has been very significant in shaping Hackney as a place. Skipping over a few years of history, in the post-Second World War period, when the borough had become a good deal poorer, Hackney attracted large numbers of migrants from the Caribbean, many of whom were recruited to come and work in London to fill labour shortages in those post-war years, what we now call the Windrush migration. And over the following decades, other populations arrived too, from countries in Africa, like Nigeria and Ghana, from other countries in Europe, Turkey, places like Cyprus and Greece, and then from places further afield, such as Bangladesh and Pakistan. And then more recently from European countries like Poland, Spain and France, but also further afield again from places like Australia. Today, Hackney is one of the most diverse places in London, and we can learn why this is the case by looking at this history of migration. We could say much more about Hackney's history as a place. We could say a good deal more about the main layers of its historical development and the local, the national and the global connections, the flows of people, the flows of capital, ideas and cultures that have shaped it. But what I'm going to do now is focus on the more recent past so that we can get back in a moment to our hipsters to understand why they have become such a phenomenon in Hackney today and to judge the effects that they are having on the place. So the economic problems and the social deprivation that were evident in Hackney when I moved there in 1995 had been a characteristic of the neighbourhood for much of the preceding 30 years. And over this time, employment in manufacturing in East London fell sharply. This was a key economic trend. So in 1971, the year of my birth, around 32% of the workforce were engaged in manufacturing. By 2011, the figure was 5%, and we await the new data from the 2021 census, probably lower still than that 5% from 2011. So this was part of a wider process of deindustrialisation that was taking place in London and in the rest of the UK. So it was a tough time for many inner city neighbourhoods as people were losing jobs and there were a lack of opportunities, and all this led to a range of quite complex social problems. And in places like Hackney, where there were large migrant populations, racial tensions start to emerge as far-right groups turn upon people of colour and often blame them for the economic malaise that everyone was experiencing. The decline in manufacturing that led to some of Hackney's social problems also coincided with a restructuring of the London economy in the 1980s, so that it became much more focused on business and financial services, and crucially also more globally oriented. So politically and economically, there was a desire to make London a preeminent global city. Deregulation of the City of London, what we call the Square Mile or the financial district, under Margaret Thatcher, pictured here, and her Chancellor to the left, Nigel Lawson, particularly via a raft of legislation known as the Big Bang that was passed in October 1986. This created a boom and money flooded in to the financial sector, to London's city economy at that time. But alongside that, at the same time, as economic priorities changed, many Hackney residents were losing their jobs in manufacturing. They lacked the skills, the education, the training to gain new employment in the service sector, in the financial sector that was booming down the road in the city, and consequently poverty and deprivation increase. So they were suffering. But while economic restructuring causes havoc for those people, for other people, it creates some new opportunities. So employment in financial and business services in the city, and then later at Canary Wharf that was being built at the time that I'm speaking of, this creates a new middle class in London, sometimes known as the service class, as various sociologists have labelled them. People who are highly skilled, highly educated, people who earn very high salaries working in business and financial services. So they were doing very well at the time, and at the same time another segment in London's economy starts to grow. Its creative sector of designers, of artists, of digital technology specialists and so on. And for these two sets of people, the people working in the city, in the financial and business services, and the creatives, Hackney represents an opportunity. So for the creative sorts, it offered cheap rents and vacant spaces, such as old warehouses, that were really well suited to the types of venues that groups like, say, interior or fashion designers or architects like to work in. Those people were also really fascinated by Hackney as a place. They liked its diversity. They were interested in its unrealised creative potential, its edginess, even its shabbiness. And for those people working in financial and business services in the city or down at Canary Wharf, Hackney offered two things. Easy proximity to workplaces. You can cycle to the city in 20 minutes. And also, crucially, a large stock of cheap Victorian housing that might be gentrified to create spacious and high quality places to live in. Many of these people were also attracted by Hackney's diversity and its vibe. This was a generation, many of them had been brought up in the suburbs of London, and they were keen to return to the excitement and the social possibilities offered by a revitalised inner city. And so after the 1990s recession, which we were at the tail end of when I arrived in Hackney in 1995, the place starts to change, and it does so really quite rapidly. A new layer or phase in Hackney's development as a place begins around about this period. And a clear indication of this would be to look at house prices, which offer a crude barometer of the gentrification process that has washed through Hackney and many other parts of London over the past 30 to 40 years. And if you want to investigate this for yourself, the Land Registry, if you Google that, is a great source for looking at changing house prices in your neighbourhood. And you can see the trend very clearly on that graph for Hackney there. The average price of a house in Hackney today, as you can see, is around about £650,000. So a lot more than the £63,000 that we paid for our one-bedroom flat back in 1995. In fact, actually, today Hackney's most expensive house has just sold for £10 million. Here it is pictured on Navarino Road. £10 million. Recently bought, interestingly, by the rapper Drake as a second or a fourth or fifth home, in fact. Again, I guess we might label him as a creative professional. But let's get back to our hipsters. It's really hard to know for sure what it is that hipsters do to make a living. How do they afford houses and flats at those sorts of prices. Many of them seem to have plenty of leisure time to drink their coffee and hang out in trendy cafes with their MacBooks with no socks on. The impression is that plenty of them have money to spend. That sociable hipster lifestyle doesn't come cheap. So London's globally oriented creative and service economy is likely the main source of their wealth. And maybe some of them are not really hipsters at all. Maybe they're hipsters at the weekend, but maybe they work in the city in a suit during the rest of the week. Now, there is a danger that we overstate the significance of hipsters and hipsterification. A hipster is a label, it's an identity, it's a lifestyle to which some people aspire. Maybe it's a thing that's now gone, maybe it's a thing of a few years ago. And to me, hipsterification is probably best thought of as a particular kind of consumption-oriented or consumption-led gentrification, a process that we're witnessing across London and in many other towns and cities in the UK and beyond too. And as with gentrification, we've got a new group arriving, they've moved into the neighbourhood, they've bought up houses and business premises, they've improved them, they've done them up, they've invested in them, often leaving a very visible impression on the place. And if you think about it, there's a definite hipster aesthetic, isn't there? Often buildings painted dark grey or black with small white writing, as illustrated here with some Hackney examples. But as with gentrification, there are questions that we need to ask about the impacts of hipsterification on places like Hackney. Not everybody has benefited from gentrification. Rising house prices and rents marginalise and, even worse, can displace existing residents, force them to go elsewhere. And there are plenty of clues to this process if you look carefully at Hackney street art, such as this pub here in Hackney Wick, which became an anti-gentrification mural. It becomes too expensive for some people to continue living in and running businesses in Hackney. So as these posters explained, poor people should leave quietly. So that's not right, is it? Should we therefore resist hipsterification and gentrification? Should we just try to stop it happening? Should we keep Hackney shit, as this particular image suggests here? You know, is gentrification something that we can stop? Can we resist it? Or is it something that we just can't stop? It's irrepressible. The pub that I showed you a moment ago with all that graffiti on itself, remarkably, has now been gentrified. And there's a real irony there that that anti-gentrification monument has itself now been done up and is an expensive, trendy pub in Hackney Wick. Quite different social worlds seem to coexist in Hackney today. So we have our hipsters who spend large portions of their day drinking expensive cups of coffee in trendy cafes, but they live alongside many people who struggle to get by on low wages. Like many local authorities, Hackney publishes annual area profiles, a very useful resource for those of you studying changing places. And the Hackney example tells us that while the place has changed and is continuing to change, largely actually in a positive direction, life has not improved for everybody. Not everybody has been carried along by the change. Deprivation is still a problem. Health measures, including life expectancy, suggest that the borough is behind other areas. Rates of child poverty and unemployment are higher, and lots of people are struggling to pay private rents on housing, particularly during this cost of living crisis. And it's only just over a decade ago that Hackney, along with other places in London, experienced riots and unrest, where we were reminded that not everybody felt that they were benefiting from the hipster-led transformation of Hackney, or more widely, the globalisation of London's economy. So inequality persists as a major problem, I think, for London, and is exemplified by what's happening in Hackney. So are hipsters a problem? This actually quite problematic headline of an article published in the Daily Telegraph would seem to suggest that they are part of the problem. Indeed, they have been the focus of all sorts of anger and resentment, as the 2015 attack on the serial killer cafe on Brick Lane, which is not in Hackney but close by, illustrated. The Serial Killer Cafe, in case you're not familiar with it, it's now closed down actually, was a cafe where you could go and buy a bowl of cereal, a kind of slightly wacky bowl of cereal, an American kind of cereal. And you would pay sort of £5 for a bowl of cereal, so it was seen as a symbol of hipster indulgence. So like many places in London, Hackney is a fantastic place to live if you have a good income, but if you don't have money, because the benefits of London's economic transformation into a global city have not trickled down to you, then life in Hackney is difficult, and it's perhaps getting worse rather than better. So that is a major problem. And perhaps I've been a bit too one-sided in my presentation. I've been seduced by this quirky figure of the hipster. Hackney isn't all beards and sourdough. There are lots of other experiences of place change in East London that are actually often less heard about. So hipstification is perhaps a racialised process. Perhaps it's mainly a story of white middle-class privilege. Gentrification often exacerbates inequalities and sharpens social distinctions, as this great book by Joy White tells us, and illustrates that argument with reference to Forest Gate near Stratford in East London. So we have a responsibility to investigate place change from a range of perspectives, not just from that of the hipster. Now it's time for me to wrap up. I've been giving a version of this lecture for several years now, and I was therefore a bit worried to read in the Financial Times a couple of years ago that the coronavirus pandemic may have spelled the end of trendy East London. That's going to put me out of a job. But actually, if you read the article that follows, the answer is no, it's not really going to spell the end of trendy East London. Places continue to change, and I guess we're only beginning to understand the impacts that the pandemic has had, or is having still, on places everywhere. So perhaps this leaves us with some key questions that make studying place change a matter not just of enhancing our geographical understanding, but of developing responsible citizenship. How do we make places better for everyone? How can we ensure that change includes people and does not exclude or displace them? Is there another model of place change in London, or indeed anywhere, that avoids some of the problems of gentrification or of hipstification? And as geographers, I think it's exciting that we can grapple with these sorts of questions. So come to Queen Mary, become a hipster if you like, and let's address these important issues together. Thank you very much.